Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of today's webinar is, as you can see on the screen in front of you now, structures and role descriptions, and what we're doing is exploring the new Department for Education guidance. We'll come on to the webinar proper in just a few moments, but just for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with this particular platform, if you haven't actually managed to locate the go-to toolbar yet, there'll be a little orange rectangle with a white arrow in it floating somewhere in the top right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on that, it will open the toolbar for you, and it will stay there throughout the session. That will enable you to download the copy of the handout, which is basically a replication of all of the slides that we're going to be sharing with you today. Just click on the document icon there. You can do that anytime during the webinar immediately afterwards, or it will be available from the Governors for Schools website later in the day as well. You will also see the question panel on your toolbar. If you have any questions or comments at any stage during the session this morning, please do post those up there and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to them. We've got some very large numbers expected this morning, so we may not be able to get through all the questions, but if, as ever, if we don't manage to do that, we will respond to you individually after the webinar finishes. And last but by no means least, from a housekeeping point of view, hopefully you can all locate the little hand icon on your toolbar. Just by way of a sound test, if you can hear me okay, if I could ask you to raise your hand by clicking on that icon now, I'd be very grateful. Lovely. I can see we've got a lot of seasoned attenders joining us this morning. Raise their hands before I finish the sentence there, so that's fantastic. Lovely. I see lots of people putting their hands up now, so we will assume that everybody's got their volume settings sorted. So I'll put your hands down for you now. Okay, so with no more ado, we will start the session. As I say, we're focusing today on the DfE guidance that was published back in October now, and it's called Structures and Role Descriptions. And a warm welcome on behalf of myself, Steve Barker, and Linda Waghorn. We're here representing Better Governor, and we're delighted as ever to be working alongside Governors for Schools. And as I say, we'll be facilitating this webinar between the two of us this morning, but we can see all of the questions as they come in. So please do keep those coming and keep your comments coming as well. And we'll do our level best, as I said earlier, to respond to those. So good morning, Linda, are you there?
I am. Good morning, everyone.
Lovely. Okay, so as far as this morning's session is concerned, what we want to try and do by the time we get to the end of the session, and we will aim to finish as close to 9 o'clock as we possibly can, certainly explore the headlines in the new guidance that was published in October. Think about putting into context what the latest expectations are on governance. And when we say the latest expectations, I think the backdrop to all of this is this may be new guidance. There is no new legislation, so nothing has really changed in terms of the legal background to governance. What this is doing really, and we'll say this as we go through anyway, is bringing a lot of documents, or the content, the key themes from those documents together, and perhaps putting it in a slightly different light at the end of 2020 going into 2021. So at the end of the day, what we're actually really aiming for from this webinar is to give everyone the opportunity to reflect on how should we, as governors, as trustees in our various schools and trusts up and down the country, how should we be responding and using this guidance moving forward into next year? And with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Linda at that stage, and I will come back in a little bit later.
Thank you, Steve. So if we think about our governance, and some of you will be seasoned governors and have a number of years sometimes behind your experience. Steve and I have both been governing for 20 years plus, which makes us very seasoned, but everything changes proportionately over that period of time. So for those of you that are new, these documents are really, really helpful because they're good first level introductions into how all of this works together. When Steve and I became governors, there used to be a printed handbook that was sent to all governors in the post, and you got little bits that you updated and put in there as legislation and regulation changed, and it was very much written in a legal type of language, and those were the only documents that supported the way the expectations that governors had and the way in which we needed to work, and the content of what we needed to do. Now, over the years, with the changes that have happened to governance, there have been a whole variety of things, not least the fact that we have two types of publicly supported education establishments. We have maintained schools, and we'll say a little bit more about the difference a little bit later in the session. Basically, they work under the local authorities' remit, and those are the types of schools that we would have recognised 20 years ago. And then into the intervening period, the introduction of academies, and they have the purpose initially was very different to the purpose and structure now. So the greatest evolution, and it's not been a revolution, the greatest evolution possibly has been around academy trust governance, but there is still confusion, not least between parents and what type of school their child is going to, because they look exactly as they always did. Free schools, slightly different, they're under that academies legislation, but they haven't existed in most cases as anything else before. So lots of changes in the school system, and when somebody becomes a governor, that possibly is the first revelation that they have. Oh, what type of system, what type of organisation am I working in? So although, as Steve said in the introduction, neither of these booklets, and they're written in very plain English, they're very easy to understand, and I believe they do give you that first level understanding of what each of these structures and the role of different people within those structures look like. And I think although it doesn't bring in any new legislation or new, it pulls together other things, what it does is it just sets it out in a very clear way. And I think it's really helpful that these documents have been published, because I think a lot of people will find them useful to just get a better understanding of what we're talking about. So let's move on and just kind of link this all together and just say a little bit more deeply about what I've already explained. So we've got the documents, the base documents themselves, and then as you read through the document, and some of you may well have had a look at these already. They're not long documents, not in DfE terms. They might be long documents in business terms, but they are documents that do set it out quite succinctly for the DfE. But they include, as you go through, if you use it electronically, which most of us do with our documentation these days, there are links and references to all of the main other documents that have been published. So the governance handbook, which we originally had to explain the expectations, its sisters, the competency framework for governance for both academies and for maintained schools, and at the same time, these were published in 2017, the competency framework. So this sets out the knowledge, skills and behaviours that governors and clerks need to have in order to carry out the expectations of the governance handbook. Then getting deeper into the constitution of governing bodies for maintained schools, that sets out what type of governors have to be in place in maintained schools, and links back to something called the instrument of government, which sets out the numbers of people and how they come to be either elected or appointed as governors. So in this document, it sets out all of the expectations, the knowledge, skills and behaviours, and the constitution of that board. And so it makes it very clear that these are the people and where they come from. So they have that stakeholder mix that represents their local school community. And it sets out what the expectations are, and it gives you that further detail about how this is related to the local authority and what their role is. So for academies, this is a slightly different linked document, because you've still got those links to the governance handbook and the competency framework. But of course, in an academy trust, And what we need to just reinforce here is that governance as a legal function happens at trust board level. So all of this, the fullness of all of this information applies to the trust board. In almost all cases, you will have within a multi-academy trust, if you're not a standalone trust, some kind of governance structure at local level. And that local level structure, that will describe what has been delegated, what those responsibilities that are still legally held by the board, but have been devolved down and provided to those at local level. So when we're looking at this document, the link there is to the funding agreement and to the articles, because that is where you will find the constitution of the trust board. So at this level, it's talking about the trust, the role and structure of the trust, and again, it has those references to other publications such as the Academy's Financial Handbook, but they're referenced in passing rather than embedded into those links.
And I think it's fair to say there, Linda, as well, that certainly if you're not familiar with academy structures, because an academy is a very specific type, yes, it's state funded, as Linda said, but because it is a company, it's governed by company law as well as charitable law, and of course education regulations as such. But the funding agreement is actually a contract between the Department for Education and the individual trust. And so that's why we have these different layers here. But I think the Academy Trust Structures and Role Descriptors publication is really helpful, because what it's done, I think, is bring some much needed clarity to most of the areas relating to the funding agreement, which is the contract. And there's various other elements that define and obviously put some boundaries around the roles and structures.
And the department has tried in the past to add clarity, and they've published different pieces of guidance, but it brings it all together in one place. And I believe if you start with this document, you get that basic understanding that then allows you to delve deeper into the other things that we need to look at and still make sense of how you link it back into, oh yes, this is how it is structured in my academy trust, in my local board, if that's where you sit. So let's look at a little bit more at that structure and just see how this relates to each of you. And I know we've got quite a large audience today, so there'll probably be people that will be able to recognise the type of school they're in, and therefore this very simple explanation. And there's some very good graphs in the graphical representations rather in the documents that give this in a little bit more detail. So for maintained schools, the Department for Education is the top of the tree, if you like. And so that is where the legislation, the funding, everything comes originally from that government department, large government department, down through the local authority. So the funding for each school, for each local authority, is passported from the department to the local authority. And over the years, more and more of that funding that is provided by the department reaches the school. In the past, it was quite a lot more that was retained at local authority level and was managed for all of the schools beneath that structure. I think back to my childhood, the textbooks arrived from the local authority because the local authority had made some of those decisions with the funding. So almost all of the funding that is received from the department, there is a small amount retained now, but that is distributed to all of the schools within its control under a funding formula. And there is representation from schools and includes governance around how that formula is calculated, and then all of the schools within that local authority area work to that funding formula, report their funding through financial expectations to the local authority, and also on behalf of the Department of Education, they are responsible for making sure that those schools are providing a good standard of education. Now, they do that at a distance because, of course, the role of ensuring that the school is doing that is the governing body of each school within that local authority area. They are responsible for the majority of that passported funding from the Department for Education, that funded formula that comes to the school. They are responsible for the oversight of that, and they are responsible for the oversight of standards and performance of each school. And they report back via the local authority to the Department for Education. In academies, the Department for Education is still at the top of that tree, but as Steve said, these are academies are both charities and companies, so companies who have all of those expectations of both charity and company regulation, but they also have all of the governance responsibilities. So the department, via the Education Skills Funding Agencies, passport 100% of the funding to the Trust Board, and it is the Trust Board that is responsible here in law for both the governance, standards and performance, and finance. And the Trust Board, if it is a single school academy, is also the governing body for the school. If it is a multi-academy trust, then it will delegate some, but probably not all, of its responsibilities down to a local governing board. And it doesn't have to be called a local governing board. You may think mine's called a local academy committee. It can be called, the language it doesn't matter what the trust decides to call that local level, but often they are called local governing boards. But you shouldn't confuse the terminology of governor with having those full governance responsibilities. You need to refer back to the scheme of delegation. I think Steve's going to say a little bit more about delegation a little later in the session. So basically, those are the two types of schools that we operate with public funding. And I think, Steve, we're just going to say a little bit more, but is there any questions about those structures before I just move on to?
No questions, but I think it was just an added comment I would make on both of them. So irrespective of which form of government or state-funded part of the education system you're actually operating in as governors, important to go back to those documents from Linda's and my perspective, just to make sure you have a thorough understanding of how that, if you like, that hierarchy, that accountability structure actually works, particularly in academies, because it's further complicated in academies by the existence of what are called members who don't sit on the trust board, so they are not the accountable body as such, but they do have very real responsibilities, and on occasions they have powers that they can invoke as well. So really important that you understand who does what in your respective trusts if you are operating within the academy part of the system.
And again, I think this document works well for any individual or member of an organisation that's connected with this. I'd quite like to see it being used by local authority education officers, for example, to understand how this works in terms of governance. I'd like to see members using it, and it also describes the role of the different role of the local authority, the role of the members in these documents, and again, good and helpful first line explanation.
Indeed. We do have one question that's actually come in, Linda, from Lee, and Lee's question is saying, in a multi-academy trust, is it essential to have a local governing body and a board of trustees?
That's a really interesting question. Often these are, if it's a single trust board, they often will have, if it's a single academy, they'll often have the trust board is also the governing board, and they'll work seamlessly together. I'm in a small 3-school multi-academy trust, which initially started out as a federation between 2 schools. So a federated maintained school has a single governing body for 2 schools or more, but in this case 2 schools. Let's keep it simple. When that school then became a multi-academy trust, they retained that one board, but when they took on a 3rd school, there are only actually 2 local boards, even though one now looks after the interests of 2 schools and one looks after the interests of the remaining school. So it isn't essential, and there isn't a regulation that says you must have local governing boards, because of course it is the trust board that is responsible. So there are occasions where schools double up and have a single local board, and there are other times where there will be within a multi-academy trust a local arrangement in every school, but it isn't essential. It's for the trust to decide what is in the best interests of good performance, good local governance.
And as Linda says, we will explore that a little bit more detail when we talk about delegation later on. But the legal requirement here is that the trust board exists, because they are the people who are ultimately responsible for the performance of the trust, irrespective of how many schools are there. So as Linda said, I mean, in essence, they're wearing 3 hats. One of the bits of clarity that the department has actually brought in now with these new publications is that they are only referring to them now as boards of trustees. Now, of course, they're called trustees because of the charitable status. Academies are what's called charitable companies limited by guarantee. So the charitable part means that they're trustees. The company element means that they're directors, because there's an application of company law here as well, of course. And of course, first and foremost, they are governors because it's a school. So we can't forget that. And as Linda says, anybody else at local level can call themselves governors, but actually the legal governors are those people that sit on that trust board. So the important point here is that that's the legally required entity. One quick question here from Victoria before we move on. Victoria is saying she's chair of a pupil referral unit where they're known as a management committee. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're absolutely right, Victoria, and I'm sorry we didn't actually mention that, but any pupil referral units, hospital, schools, are all treated in the same way, and the legislation relating to them actually says for management committee read governing body, for management committee member read governor. So the regulations and everything that we've said applies equally for pupil referral units on the maintained school side as it does to mainstream schools. So apologies for that.
Welcome, Victoria. We don't often have anyone joining us from a pupil referral unit, and I did sit on a management committee of a pupil referral unit some years ago, and yes, that again has gone through an evolution, because they certainly didn't have governance arrangements. They were under the local authorities' control in a much deeper way in the past. So so yes, now we have a very similar structure and set of expectations. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, we're going to have a poll in a few moments that will just maybe help clarify this for the majority of you, but I just wanted to clarify some other considerations and think about what else is mentioned in this document. If we could move on to the next slide, Steve, that would be really helpful. First of all, it clarifies the role of the clerk. Now that's very clear, I think, in the governance handbook and the competency framework. But unless you're a clerk, or an effective chair, it's unusual as a governor to read much around the role of the clerk, to actually look at what your clerk is supposed to do. We've delivered a couple of other sessions in the last week, Steve and I, and a couple of comments that have been made there have really reinforced how significant a part the clerk has played in improving the performance of governance in their school. So the professional role of the clerk, so again, this is a role that has evolved over time. The professional role of the clerk in knowing a lot about governance and being able to provide advice and guidance. They are not just the person that takes the minutes. And again, this is described in better detail, particularly in the academies version of this booklet. And so your clerk is fundamentally important to effective governance. It gives some better detail and pulls together the role of the different parts in schools of religious character. So it sets that picture out and makes sure that that is explicit around the ethos of the school. It talks about the role of Ofsted, and Ofsted's role is a little different at the moment because of the pandemic, but it talks about that relationship of Ofsted. And for academies, whilst they don't, regional schools commissioners exist within the school system for everyone, their role is to ensure standards on behalf of the Department for Education. Their role is much more explicit in most cases in academies, because the local authority is having that oversight of the schools it's in its area and is expected to work with the Regional Schools Commissioner. The Regional Schools Commissioner, 8 of them across the country, expected to have oversight of the academies and free schools within that area. It talks about delegation. Steve is going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, and it makes those links to statutory and contractual obligations. So those pieces of information are really helpful when you are new to governance and are trying to understand how this all fits together. And also, if you have been a governor for some time, it helps you see how that has evolved to where we are for 2021. So I think, Steve, we've got a poll coming next. If you could just give some instructions for those who haven't used a poll with us before. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, I'm going to launch that poll now, folks, and that should be appearing on your screen any moment now. There we go, it's up now. This is asking you really to identify which type of governor you are in your various organisations represented here today. You can only choose one, so please do make your selection. If for any reason you experience any difficulty in accessing the poll, it may be because you're actually in a widescreen mode. So if you just minimize your screen for a moment, that should free up the voting panel, and that will actually allow you to vote. Couple of people putting comments on that they're governors in free schools. The moment your free school is established, folks, you are treated as an academy. So please tick, if you are a governor in a free school, that falls under the academy setup. So please tick that.
And if anyone like Victoria is in a pupil referral unit, just type that in the question box, and that will remind us that we missed you off the poll. So apologies, but if you're in anything that you don't recognise as fitting neatly into one of those explanations, then just type in the question box, and Steve and I can pick that up.
And it's lovely to see that we've got several clerks joining us this morning. Please don't, despite the fact we have not included a clerk in here, obviously a clerk is not a governor as such, but we are clearly always welcoming the presence of clerks on these sessions. Anything that clerks do to broaden their own professional development is to be applauded by all of us in governance, and we will come back to the role of the clerk as we go through this. Linda's actually mentioned it on this slide already, but clearly part of the role of the clerk is to have that advice, support and guidance role with regard to the trust board or the governing body. Therefore, it's absolutely crucial that clerks are part of, if you like, the broader awareness of documents like this, because in many of our governing boards and trusts, they will be the primary users. Okay, we've got about 85% of you, so a couple more moments there, and then we'll close that poll. So if you want to vote, ladies and gents, a couple more moments to do that, and then we will close the poll down and share the outcomes of that with you. Obviously, we've got a few people putting comments on that, like Linda and I, they're governors in more than one setting, and yes, that's you can take your pick over which box you tick in that case, folks. Okay, I'm going to close that poll now, and then we'll share those results with you. And sorry, they should be there now. Thank you. I seem to have a little bit of a problem sharing the poll results, unfortunately. I do actually have them in front of me, so I can read them out, but for some reason we've got a slight glitch on the system this morning. It won't actually let me share the slide. It keeps dropping out. The slide will actually appear in the recording, hopefully, but just so you know, folks, 18% of you attending this morning who voted have actually said that you're a trustee in an academy trust, 20% sitting on either a local academy board or a local academy committee, whatever it's actually called in your setting. 53% of you governors in maintained schools, 8% governors in schools of religious character, and 1% not sure. So again, if you're in the 1%, good idea just to actually go back and double check. And of course, the best person to ask for that is your clerk, I would suggest. So apologies, I'm not quite sure how we've got that. That's never happened with us before, and Linda and I are using this system 3-4 times a week and have been for the last 4 years. So that's a bit of an oddball. So apologies there. Just to a quick scan, there were lots of people commenting on the poll, etc. So we've got a lot of people here. Talking about their role in schools of religious character.
Brian is a member of a trust, of an academy trust, so that's great. Welcome to you, Brian. So all layers represented, I think, here with quite a lot of comments.
As I say, we've got a few clerks, and we've got more than a few. Actually, we've got quite a number of clerks, which is, I say, that's lovely to see. So thank you. Okay, shall we move on at that stage, Linda?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So that's where we want to be, right? Okay, so ultimately what we're talking about, and this is just a little bit of a summary slide, really, this next one. Governance is about responsibility, of course, and we have to think about who is legally responsible or who is the legally accountable body. And in maintained schools, of course, that is the governing body. We are accountable to a whole host of different people, not least of all the local authority, as Linda has already made very clear. But obviously, we're accountable to all of those various stakeholders in our school as well. And similar position in an academy structure, but of course there we are talking about the trust board, and we've had a couple of questions already relating to the role of members in trust boards. Members are not, I'm trying to avoid using the word members. Members do not sit on the trust board is the way I will phrase that. Members' role is often equated by the department to that of ordinary shareholders in a public company. In other words, they have a non-executive role. They don't sit on the trust board, but they have certain responsibilities and certain powers. But in essence, the role of the members is to be assured that governance is effective within the trust. And if it's not, they would then be expected to invoke their powers. But members do not get involved, should not get involved, and must not get involved in the day-to-day governance of the trust. That is not their role. That role sits with the trust board.
I think when you look at the graph, the graphical representation in the book, you'll see that it makes that very clear about where members sit, and they do a sort of similar role to what the local authority does. They're sort of hands off, but their eyes open, and they only use the powers that they have if the trust board isn't doing the things that it should be doing. And in some cases, it does appoint some of the trustees, but again, it will depend on what is relevant in your trust documentation.
Indeed, and of course, all of that, and we do make this point, and we will keep hammering this home through this webinar and through many others, as Linda said already. Always, of course, supported with regards to specifically advice and guidance by a professional clerk. And I think it's really important to recognise that expectations on clerking have changed dramatically in the last 10 years or so. But of course, what we also have now is in the current Academies Financial Handbook, for example, and also reiterated through things like the School's Financial Value Standard for maintained schools, there is an expectation becoming clearer and clearer from central government now, but the clerk should be an independent clerk. And again, this concept of a professional clerk, the implication there is it isn't somebody who has it bolted onto another job within the school. It's a much bigger role than that now. It's way beyond a minute taker in a meeting. As I say, the advice, guidance and support is crucial now, and it is, of course, very important because governing body and trust board are the legally accountable body. They are responsible for compliance, and if anything else, we don't necessarily refer to this, but the clerk very often is the go-to person person in terms of compliance within the school. Certainly, they're the person that governors should be able to go to check out on compliance issues. Got a question here from Jacqueline. Jacqueline saying, I know it's only semantics, but are we not all called governing boards now? Legally, we're not actually, Jacqueline. I think the DfE has done that for convenience for quite a few years. People like the National Governance Association certainly have adopted that. But again, that's about the view that they would like to have of governance. Legally, any legal document relating to maintained schools still talks about the governing body and the instrument of government, which is the key document that sets out the responsibilities and the structure of the governing body in terms of who's on it, relates to it as a governing body. Trust board or governance board is a term that actually was coined when academies first came in. They're interchangeable. It doesn't, you're right, there is a semantics about this, but legally speaking, it should be governing body for maintained schools, although customer practice says it's probably moved on a little bit from that now. Okay, so we've been threatening to come on to the issue of delegation for quite a few moments now. I want to say something about delegation. Delegation has been a central theme of governance for many, many years. There's nothing new in that, but I think we do, in the light of that previous slide about the accountability, we have to think about what delegation means. I'm not trying to teach anyone to suck eggs by saying this morning, so forgive me, but the Oxford English Dictionary, which is what OED stands for on the panel on the slide at the moment, defines delegation as the process of giving somebody work or responsibility that would usually be yours. Now, that's okay as a working definition, but of course, what it means is, in reality, as far as governance is concerned, in the broadest sense of the meaning, is that yes, we're giving somebody that work, we're asking somebody to perform a task on our behalf, and yes, they are taking a responsibility for it, but the ultimate responsibility or accountability does not move. Trust board can delegate virtually anything it wishes. Governing bodies can delegate most things. There's some that they can't, but ultimately the responsibility still rests with the governing body or the board. So a classic example of that is you can delegate day-to-day safeguarding responsibilities to the head teacher and the leadership team of the school, and most boards would do that. However, if the school fails in its safeguarding duties, Ofsted come and point that out and put the school into a category. They lay the blame for that fairly and squarely at the feet of the trust board or the governing body, because they have failed in their duty of ensuring compliance. So we might delegate that responsibility, but we still have to think about what that looks like in reality, because actually we're still accountable we are still accountable for the performance of those tasks that we've delegated, and therefore we need some feedback as to how they've actually been conducted. So we can delegate to individuals or to committees, and again, this is common now to both trust boards and to governing bodies in maintained schools. And there are some restrictions, as I say, about certain elements of that for both. Compliance for statutory contractual frameworks has to be borne in mind. And again, contractual there is relating, of course, to academy trusts. So we have to ensure compliance not just with statutory regulations, but we have to ensure that we are compliant with the funding agreement, which is that contract that exists between the trust and the Department for Education. Always important that it is actually spelled out and recorded what is being delegated and to whom. In maintained schools, you would normally have that through terms of reference for the committees or working groups that are actually established to perform those tasks that have been delegated to them. And in academy trusts, it is a statutory requirement, and it's also a statutory requirement for trusts to publish this on their website, even though lots still don't. You must have what's called a scheme of delegation, and the scheme of delegation is intended to actually show what is delegated and to whom. So for every level of accountability, and that may even include members, because members do have the right to appoint, for example, trustees in line with their Articles of Association in a multi-academy trust situation. But that is a responsibility. Therefore, you wouldn't delegate that, but you might still show that. But the key element here is, what has the trust board delegated to the chief executive or the executive head teacher, whoever is overall operational control of the trust, what's delegated to individuals, and also what's delegated where appropriate to either that local governing body or local academy committee, as it's called. And all that is a bringing together in a single document what most of us, if we've previously been governors in maintained schools, would expect to see in various terms of reference for each of the committees that is in place.
I think this is where your clerk is fundamentally important, not only in being able to explain to you what has been delegated to the committee that you sit on or the local board that you sit on, but also in the clerk clarifying with the trust when these documents are drawn up, or clarifying if they're a clerk in a maintained school, what is it that you want this group of people to do? Because terms of reference often go unreviewed and are not explicit. So the clerk not only has a role in making sure you are compliant with what you've agreed to delegate, but also to make sure that the people who are doing the delegating are doing a full and proper job of that it's properly explained and it's very clear.
I've got a question that's come in from Paul. Paul saying, are there model schemes of delegation for different levels of responsibility? Not really. I mean, there are exemplar materials that you can get, for example, from the National Governance Association, but our advice would always be, you can't really do this off the peg. You have to think about what is the structure that you've got. So, for example, some of the larger multi-academy trusts now operate a hub model of governance, where you have local hub boards, or whatever they might actually be called. They have a responsibility possibly for several schools. So again, it would be thinking about, A, what do you want to delegate in terms of responsibilities? And that varies tremendously. And B, who are you actually going to delegate it to? So it's a question of thinking about tasks. For example, the National Governance Association template is helpful just to make you think, oh yes, we need to consider who that task is going to be delegated to. And we're thinking here about things like policy approval, etc. In multi-academy trusts, there is a move now where we are getting a lot more standardization across trusts, which the previous Regional Schools Commissioner was very keen on. So we've got a lot of trusts now who are saying local academy governance, however that's structured through a board, through a committee, is responsible for basically the key functions of school, which of course are pupil performance and ensuring that's done within a healthy and a safe environment. So safeguarding health and safety and pupil performance tend to always be delegated, but in some of the larger trusts now, nothing else is. So the responsibilities for staffing, responsibilities for finance, etc., all of those are held centrally and are the responsibility of the trust board, not of local governance. So important to think about this, and important if you're considering joining somebody else's multi-academy trust. What does their scheme of delegation say now? And are you prepared for that loss of autonomy over those particular areas? Because a lot of people don't conduct due diligence in the way perhaps it's intended to be, and then get a big surprise once they've joined a multi-academy trust that they realise they're no longer responsible for some of the things that they were as a maintained school.
What I would say about, and I can see there's a number of questions about who sets the terms of reference. The governance handbook is the guidance that sets out all the things that you are expected to do as a board. That goes back to legislation. Your clerk will help you often, and this is best practice, with a work planner to make sure that you're compliant in talking about and managing those things. The decision making is what we're talking about, delegation here. Who makes the decision? If it's a committee, then your terms of reference have to be explicit that this is what your committee does and this is the decisions it can therefore take as having that delegation given to them. The scheme of delegation is the document that does that from the trust down to the local board, and it will usually set that out over a number of areas, as Steve has says, around safeguarding, around staffing, around finances, and it will give you that clarity about how those things are done and where you need to approve things like the budget, the draft budget, the full budget, the all sorts of things around staffing. In a local, in a multi-academy trust, do you appoint your head teacher? Are you the decision maker at local level, or is it the trust board with involvement of the local governance arrangements? So it is decisions that the trust make for academies and the main governing board make for any committee, or if you're a flat structure with assigned roles, for any of those roles. And I would always encourage, if you're working in those kind of structures, to give some kind of create some kind of document from your decision making at that level that indicates what it is you have decided, so that your clerk can use that as being compliant with those discussions and the decisions that you reached as a consequence.
Absolutely right, and of course what we should always be thinking about as governors and as trustees is where we have delegated responsibilities, are we actually reflecting on whether they have actually been acted upon, and what the impact of those has been. So it's not just about giving this task to somebody else and forgetting about it. There should always be that reporting back, and as Linda said, the clerk is a very good conduit for ensuring that there is follow-up where things have been delegated. Couple of quick questions before we move on. John is asking, is the individual named on the website or the position such as chair or committee? Good practice in my view would always be you name the role. So for example, the chair of governors is responsible for, etc. I mean, if you're talking about a temporary responsibility, so each year you might appoint a separate safeguarding governor, perfectly acceptable to say the safeguarding governor is, and then you just have to make sure that the website is actually maintained, John. So I hope that answers your question. Another quick one from Christina. Christina's asking, should there be terms of reference for associate members? That's associate members of governing bodies, of course, and should we be recording that in our terms of reference, or if it's an academy situation, scheme of delegation? There isn't actually any such position as associate member within an academy, so you'd have to co-opt them there. But associate members are not governors. They cannot vote in full governing body meetings, and that's part of the statutory framework, so you wouldn't necessarily need to do that. But again, talk to your clerk, do some research about how you can involve those associate members. Why have you got them involved in the governing body? What skills, because it should be a skills-based appointment, what skills have they been brought on to actually bring to the party, and are we utilising them to that effect? So you don't need that recorded in terms of reference as such, but certainly the governing body should be very aware of it, and it should all be quite transparent, I would say.
And the clerk needs to understand what the decisions that have been made around that. Are they serving just on a committee? Do they attend full governing body meetings? How long is their term of office? Is it linked to some other role that is being undertaken for a period of time? It shouldn't be used as we haven't got room for this person, so we'll just create a post of associate member for them.
Quick question from Julia. What about the structure of governing boards in a federated school across 2 local authorities? The only time I've got, I mean, with federated governing bodies, of course, that there is only one governing body, so it doesn't actually change anything. It's a governing body across 2 or more schools. My view, Linda may differ on this, but I mean, my view would be that it doesn't matter where they are. If they're federated as a governing body, the governing body is still the responsible body. They may have dual responsibilities across 2 local authorities. I'm guessing that your school is possibly a school of religious character, and that both schools are within the same diocese, for example, but I can't think of any other instances where that may happen. Could you, Linda?
Well, no, but you'll have two budgets to provide, because as we said earlier, you've got those 2 local authorities who have different, possibly slightly different funding formulas, so there will be budget preparation separately for the schools within the federation and accountable to those local authorities. But apart from that, no, nothing different about the way you operate. That you might structure yourself, or your terms of reference might be a bit more explicit about those responsibilities for that financial and the performance oversight. But other than that, I can't see the need, and I would always, and I think Steve, you would agree with me, keeping it as simple as possible is always the best option.
Yeah, absolutely. Question, sorry, more questions coming through here. Beverly is actually asking, how often should the scheme of delegation be reviewed? Certainly, if it's only been created last year, we would suggest it's good sense to actually review it after 12 months, just to reflect on how fit for purpose it really is. Thereafter, it is possibly acceptable to extend that review and reflection period. But of course, every time there is a change in government regulation, every time there are other changes in terms of expectations on schools generally or on governance, that may be an opportunity to reflect that. But again, a good clerk will be the person who actually would be picking up on that, because hopefully they're being advised through clerks' briefings, etc. They'd pick up on that, and they'd be talking to the chair and thinking about how that could actually be fed back into a review of the scheme of delegation. Okay, so let's move on at that point. Just in terms of the roles of governors, of trustees, of everybody else involved, we've mentioned skills-based at the moment already, but again, the expectation from the DfE now is, and it's interesting that this document puts the must in here, governors must have the skills required to contribute to effective governance and the success of the school, of course. Now, the must is for maintained schools, but of course, in academies, and that's only because we don't have the same perhaps the same level of, well, not statutory guidance, but the same level of regulation is probably a more appropriate thing to say here. But of course, in all funding agreements, there is that term that says, the trust will have regard to guidance issued by the Secretary of State from time to time. And of course, the implication there is that any guidance, what we should be saying to ourselves as trustees is, well, I don't have to follow it, so I'm not going to. I think it's a far better and a far more positive nod to effective governance if we say to ourselves, why wouldn't we follow it? If it's good enough for the maintained sector, academies should not be about finding things not to do. It should be about hopefully ensuring that governance is as effective as it possibly can be. And there are lots of things that academies can and absolutely do take from regulations in maintained schools that do contribute towards effective governance. So certainly that idea of skills-based governance is something we should all be thinking about now. And what we must do is actually reflect that those skills permeate through all levels of government. So again, depending on the scheme of delegation and the responsibilities delegated to local academy boards, or whatever they happen to be called, have you got the appropriate skills needed there to reflect what's actually being delegated to those individuals? Linked to that question here from Michael saying, is there a requirement to carry out a skills audit of governance? There isn't an absolute requirement. I think there's probably an expectation, Michael, it's fair to say, because again, we have to ensure that governance is as effective as it possibly can be on an ongoing basis. Part of effective governance is about engagement in CPD, etc., in terms of training and development. And of course, skills audits are very often done as a means of identifying where there are gaps in governors' knowledge and development. And of course, not only that, but because of the dynamics of education, everything's changing, we need to be abreast of those changes.
I think it starts with recruiting people. So this document is really good as a recruitment tool because it's very clear what the role is that you're required to do. You can express in any type of recruitment processes, including parent elections, you can request the skills that you believe would be helpful for your board to have in order for it to carry out its responsibilities effectively. And if you look at that section 7 of the governance handbook, the expectation that the department have in the guidance is that all boards carry out some kind of evaluation of governance annually. You think the school does this with the school self-evaluation. Skills audit is a really good tool both to recruit people and to create your action plan of governance development for the following year, so that you develop people who have showed an interest but don't have the skills or the experience necessarily to undertake the full role yet. So I think it's best practice to carry out a skills audit of some kind on an annual basis and use it to inform recruitment and development.
And of course, just a final point before we move off this slide, of course, is that where we're moving governance now into another new year, what we should be doing is every appointment, every election that's encountered, and Linda's talked about informing elections, we should be thinking about the skills. So no, we can't stop people being elected, but we can hopefully inform those elections by saying we would particularly welcome somebody with the skills, as Linda said. So just as maybe something to carry forward with us, just to ensure that we are always doing that.
And it's clear then that they will need to be developed to fulfil that role, because if you've identified a particular area and they are elected to that role, they are elected to the board and that was your preference, then they should be willing, and hopefully your nomination letters will make that clear, willing to undertake training, and the training that you're particularly interested in making sure your board acquires and demonstrates is where you would then hopefully ask them to undertake.
Indeed. Okay, so one of the things that we do need to think about, of course, is that whatever else that we do, however we are structured, the role of governance does not change. The role of governance has always been intended to be strategic and not operational. Linda and I routinely talk about the strategic oversight that governors are intended to have, and of course that's actually reiterated within both of these documents independently, but again the message is exactly the same, as you can see. What the Department for Education is actually reiterating here, that in line with those core functions, the strategic function, accountability and value for money, etc., boards should play a strategic role and avoid routine involvement in operational matters. That does not change, and that's a responsibility on all of us as governors individually, and I would say more importantly collectively. It should not just be down to the chair to remind individual governors that, well, you're straying a little bit into the operational here. We should all be mindful, we should all be policing that ourselves, that are we operating at an appropriately strategic level? And of course, given where we've been in the last 9 months or so, governors have been drawn down the ladder of operational involvement a little bit, because the expectation was that we did perhaps spend a little bit more time poring over risk assessments linked to COVID. Yes, we've done that. That's deepened our understanding of how the process works, but now we've deepened our level of knowledge. We should go back up that ladder and operate a more strategic role, which is one of looking across the trust or across the school and saying, have we got appropriate procedures in place? Are they being monitored? Are they being adapted over time as needs change? And that's the level of assurance that we should be seeking. And Linda and I often use a phrase that is relating to the role of the governing body, which really sort of sums up this idea that we're not there to actually be strategic. To be operational, we are strategic, and therefore our role is to ensure by seeking assurance. So in other words, we don't ensure by policing, by doing it ourselves. We seek assurance through all of those forms of monitoring that, and that goes for academy trusts and for maintained schools. And of course, what we might need to think about, and again this is a little bit of a nod to the role of members specifically in academy trust, but actually this applies to all governance. There may be occasions, but these are by exception generally, where legal responsibilities of the school or the trust are not being delivered, and therefore it is important for the ultimate responsible body, the accountable body, i.e. the governing board, or governing body or the trust board, to actually intervene and do something about it, because operational matters are being neglected or actually being wrongly delivered, and therefore important to do something about it. Okay, Just very quickly, a word on the chair and vice chair. The two roles are coming closer together now in both settings. I think it's fair to say that. It is not as unusual as it was a few years ago to have co-chairs. It's far more usual to have co-vice chairs, but there is provision in legislation for both of those things to happen. But certainly we do need to think about what the role is. And I think the key change that's come about in recent years, in my view, is that the role of chair now is far more about leadership of the governing body and leadership of governance within the school or the trust than it ever was historically. And I think there was an expectation many years ago. I mean, lots of people used to use the phrase first amongst equals. That still applies. And the but now, of course, is that it is the role of the chair, sometimes the vice chair together, to ensure that the governance of the organisation is maintained at that strategic level, but most importantly is effective in terms of that element of leadership that we provide to our schools. So you can see that in the academies one, it actually talks about goes beyond chairing meetings. That's where we were many years ago. And I think, you know, whilst these are slightly different uses of the English language, the meanings are similar, but I think you could apply both of those in both settings if you wanted to have truly effective chairing in place. And the other thing, just to say before we move off that one, in too many schools historically, and I think that's the case possibly in some trusts as well, the role of the vice chair has often been seen as a little bit of a hiding place. It shouldn't be that. The vice chair is an ideal form of succession planning, and I would always say, and lots of my friends are head teachers and deputy heads. If you don't want to take the main job, don't do the vice one, is my role. Sorry, my rule rather. And I think the role of the vice chair needs to be developed. There should be some delegation, some sharing of responsibility between the chair and the vice chair. And of course, as ever, both of those roles should have a very, very strong link with the clerk, because their role is actually vital. And it's nice to see that that's actually being acknowledged here by the Department of Education as well. Okay, so just a few reminders. Not all of these are actually within the guidance, but the guidance, the spirit of the guidance, as we've said, is absolutely about good practice. And you know, don't forget, governance is about collective responsibility. Nobody has individual responsibility. Occasionally there are some powers for members, etc., and in very rare occurrences the chair has some power, but the chair absolutely has responsibilities. They don't have power. They only have power in extremis, so to speak. Governance is a public office. We haven't mentioned the Nolan principles today. They are, of course, central to the competency frameworks that we have talked about. Don't forget the Nolan principles. They are essential to effective governance. And of course, above all else, that effective governance that we're talking about is about championing the needs of the children and young people in our schools. And that should always come first. Their academic needs, but also their needs for well-being, mental health, safeguarding, a healthy environment, etc. And don't forget, of course, that as we've said this morning already, education is a dynamic process. Therefore, one of the most important things for us to do as governors is make sure that we are individually and collectively keeping abreast of what's going on in that big wide world of education that surrounds us. So just a few questions to take away and perhaps reflect on. Firstly, just thinking about what we've said this morning, we've talked about the various different models, etc. Do we recognise ourselves against these models in our own setups? How can we use this guidance to actually contribute towards even greater effectiveness going forward? And also that reminder about the clerk there. Are we utilising the skills of our clerk? Have we got a clerk with those appropriate skills? If not, what are we doing about it? But are we utilising those skills to not just support, but to contribute towards the effectiveness of governance in our schools and our trusts? Because absolutely we should be. Similarly, we've got a few actions for you to think about taking away there, folks. And this really is about how we use and ensure that this guidance is actually put to good use in our schools. As Linda said right at the very beginning, what the guidance does, it actually simplifies and puts in very clear language what a lot of other documents have said for a long time, but this is a one-stop shop now in many ways for the basic rules on structures and roles within all settings. So I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading these to you, but I'm going to just draw your attention to the penultimate one there, which, as I say, is a theme that's been somewhat fundamental to what we've said this morning. Encourage the clerk to utilise these as a tool to enable them to give us as governors the advice, support and guidance that we need. The role of the clerk is pivotal to governance in the 21st century. If you're a governor in a multi-academy trust, have a look at what the Academy Financial Handbook says this year. Even if you're not a governor in a trust, have a look at it anyway, because it's really helpful guidance on the role of the clerk and hopefully makes everybody appreciate what they do and what they can contribute if governance actually allows that to happen in the school. And very often we are the gatekeepers of that in our schools. I'm aware that time has eluded us, folks, so unless there are any burning questions, there are a couple of questions on the panel that I haven't actually been able to get through to responding to. We will get back to you individually on those after the session has ended. Sorry, it's only because we have so many people on the call this morning that we haven't actually done all those. We've run a few minutes over, so I do apologise for that. We promised you the URLs at the end. There they are on that. And just to say in closing, folks, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. We hopefully look forward to welcoming you in the future for other webinars that we might host on behalf of Governors for Schools. But in the meantime, thank you very much from Linda and I for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your days and stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much indeed and good day.
Thank you. Goodbye.